The first bullet cracked past Josephine Beckett's ear close enough that she felt the wind of it, and still she did not slow her horse. Behind her, the canyon walls rose black against a sky bruised purple with the last light of evening, and somewhere in that darkness men on horseback were shouting for her to stop, to turn back, to hand over the leather satchel strapped tight across her chest. She would not. Inside that satchel, wrapped in wet cloth and packed carefully in a tin box lined with what little ice remained from the mercantile cellar, rode 6 vials of diphtheria antitoxin serum, and 40 miles away in the mining camp of Dry Fork, 19 children lay in their beds fighting for breath that came harder with every passing hour. She had been told the serum would spoil in the desert heat if she did not reach them by morning. She had been told no rider, no freighter, no fool with a badge or a gun would cross Devil's Pass while Silas Kessler's men held it. She had been told a great many things in the last 3 days, and she had stopped listening to most of them the moment she decided to go herself. "Josephine, get down!" Timothy Merritt's voice cut through the thunder of hooves and gunfire, and she dropped low over her mare's neck just as another shot sang overhead. He was riding just behind her right stirrup, his own horse lathered white with effort, his revolver drawn and firing back into the darkness with a steadiness that seemed impossible given the pace they held. "Keep to the wash. There is a bend ahead where the walls narrow. If we can reach it before them, we will lose them in the dark." She did not answer him. She could not spare the breath. The mare beneath her had been running for the better part of an hour and her lungs were beginning to labor, but Josephine kept her heels pressed tight and her eyes fixed on the pale ribbon of dry riverbed unspooling ahead of them, and she thought of small faces in Dry Fork she had never seen and never would unless she lived through the next 10 minutes. This was not how she had imagined it would go 3 days before, when the telegram first came clattering into Cottonwood Falls. The telegraph office in Cottonwood Falls, Arizona Territory, was a narrow clapboard building at the end of Main Street, and it was there that Josephine Beckett had been standing on an October afternoon in 1896 when the operator, a thin, nervous man named Whitfield, came running out into the street with a yellow slip of paper trembling in his hand. "Dr. Beckett." He had shouted, though it was Josephine and not her father who stood nearest, sorting bottles of carbolic acid and quinine on the porch of the small clinic her father kept beside the mercantile. "Dr. Beckett, there is a wire from Dry Fork. It is urgent. It says children are dying." Josephine had taken the paper from his shaking hand because her father, Elias Beckett, was inside resting his bad hip, the one that had never healed right since a wagon accident 2 winters past, and it was more often Josephine than her father who read the messages first these days and decided which ones required waking him. She had read the words twice before she understood them fully. "Diphtheria outbreak, Dry Fork camp stop, 19 children ill, 3 dead, stop, no antitoxin in camp, stop, beg assistance, stop Dr. Harlan Graves." Her father had come to the doorway then, leaning on his cane, his silver hair disheveled from his rest, and when she handed him the telegram his face had gone the color of old parchment. "Diphtheria," he said quietly. "Lord help them. There is antitoxin at the Prescott Depot, I am certain of it. The railroad brought a shipment through not 2 weeks past, but Dry Fork lies 40 miles east of here past Devil's Pass and no train runs there." "Then someone must ride it," Josephine said. Her father had looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes told her he already knew what she was thinking and already dreaded it. "Someone must ride through Kessler's territory," he said. "The man has held that pass for the better part of a year now, ever since the water dispute turned to shooting between the Circle M outfit and the small ranchers. No freight wagon has crossed since August. Sheriff Dunmore lost 2 deputies trying to run the blockade with supplies for the army post beyond it. Then we will send for the antitoxin from Prescott, and I will carry it myself. Josephine." Her father's voice had cracked, not with anger but with fear, the particular fear of a man who had already buried a wife and could not bear the thought of burying a daughter too. You will do no such thing. I forbid it." But by evening the town council had gathered in the back room of the mercantile, and not a single man among them, not the blacksmith, not the young deputy who had taken over after the shooting in August, not even the freight company's own hired riders, would agree to make the crossing. They spoke of Kessler's men in low, frightened voices, of how the outlaw band had grown bold since the range war began, taking whatever livestock crossed their claimed territory and turning back anyone who did not pay a toll they had no legal right to demand. The army post beyond Dry Fork had sent word twice asking for a military escort, and twice the request had been denied for lack of available troops, the nearest cavalry detachment being 3 days distant. "I will go," Josephine said into the silence that followed, and every head in that crowded room turned toward her. The mayor, a portly man named Wexler who had never much cared for the idea of a doctor's daughter speaking her mind in council meetings, cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Beckett, this is no ride for a woman." "It is no ride for anyone by the sound of it," Josephine answered, "and yet children are dying while we sit here arguing about who ought to be brave enough to save them. I have ridden that country before, hunting quail with my father when I was a girl. I know the back trails along the Verd, the ones that skirt the pass to the south. I can be in Prescott by tomorrow noon, collect the antitoxin from the depot, and if I ride through the night I can reach Dry Fork before the serum spoils." "Alone," Wexler said, as though the word itself were an accusation. It was then that Timothy Merritt rose from the back corner of the room where he had been standing quietly through the whole debate, hat in his hands, a young man of 27 with sun-browned skin and pale gray eyes that Josephine had noticed more than once at church socials, though she had never spoken more than a dozen words to him in the 2 years she had known his face. "She will not be alone," Timothy said. "I will ride with her." The room turned to him now, and Josephine felt her heart do something strange and sudden in her chest, though she could not have said in that moment whether it was gratitude or something else entirely. "Merritt," Wexler said slowly, "you work for the Circle M. Kessler's men have been shooting at Circle M riders for the better part of a year. You would be riding into the very territory of men who want you dead." "I know that country better than any rider in this town," Timothy said, "better even than Kessler's own men, because I grew up on it before the Circle M ever laid claim to it. My father ran cattle along the Verd before I was old enough to walk, and I learned every wash and box canyon between here and Dry Fork before I learned my letters. If anyone can get Miss Beckett through that pass without being seen, it is me, Doctor." Beckett, who had insisted on being carried to the meeting despite his hip, looked at the young cowboy with an expression Josephine could not quite read. "Timothy Merritt," he said, "you set that boy's leg for me 2 years back, did you not, when the bull gored him at the Circle M roundup? I remember you would not leave until you knew he would walk again." "You saved that boy's life, Doctor," Timothy said. "I have not forgotten it. If your daughter means to ride into danger to save other men's children, I will not sit in this town and let her ride alone." Josephine looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw not the quiet ranch hand she had passed on the street 100 times without a second thought, but a man who had just offered, in front of the whole town, to risk his life for people he had never met, because a debt of gratitude sat heavy on his conscience, and because, though she did not yet know it, he had loved her quietly and hopelessly for the better part of 2 years, without ever once believing a doctor's educated daughter would look twice at a man who mucked stalls and mended fences for wages. The council argued a while longer, but in the end there was no other volunteer, and by the time the meeting broke apart into the cool October dusk, it had been decided. Josephine Beckett and Timothy Merritt would ride for Prescott at first light, collect the antitoxin, and attempt the crossing through the back trails Timothy knew, avoiding Devil's Pass itself where Kessler's men kept their heaviest watch. That night Josephine's father sat with her long after the lamp should have been extinguished, turning his old service revolver over in his weathered hands. "Your mother would tell me I am a fool to let you go," he said at last. "Mother would tell you that you could not have stopped me," Josephine said gently, "and she would be right." He laughed, a short broken sound, and pressed the revolver into her hands. "It was your grandfather's before it was mine. It has never failed to fire when it was needed. I pray to God you will not need it, but I would rather you carry it and never use it than face that pass unarmed." She took the weapon and held it a moment, feeling its weight, thinking of the small hands and fevered faces waiting for her 40 miles distant, thinking of the debt she owed to every patient her father had ever turned away his own rest to save. "I will come home, Papa," she said. "See that you do," he said, and his voice broke on the words, and he held her the way he had not held her since she was a small girl afraid of thunder. They rode out of Cottonwood Falls before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridges, Josephine on her father's steady bay mare, Timothy on a rangy gray gelding he called Ash, and the town watched them go with a silence that felt to Josephine like held breath, as though the whole of Cottonwood Falls understood that something was being asked of them that no town ought to have to ask of two of its own. The ride to Prescott took the better part of the day, along a rutted wagon road that wound through stands of juniper, and past the crumbling adobe walls of an old mission long abandoned. Josephine and Timothy spoke little at first, both of them absorbed in the business of covering ground, but as the miles wore on and the awkwardness of forced companionship began to soften into something easier, they found themselves talking. "You said your father ran cattle on that land before the Circle M," Josephine said, as they paused to water the horses at a shallow creek crossing. "What happened to him?" Timothy's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. "There was a range war before this one when I was a boy of 12. Different men, different grievances, but the same story it always is out here, men fighting over water and grass because the land will not give enough to satisfy everybody's greed. My father tried to stay neutral. He would not join either side. They burned our barn for it, and when he rode out to see who had done it, he did not come home again." "I am sorry," Josephine said quietly. "It was a long time ago." He looked away, toward the hazy blue line of mountains in the distance. "I went to work for the Circle M when I was 14, because they were the only outfit that would take on a boy with no family and no money, and I have ridden for them ever since. I do not love them, Miss Beckett. I do not love this war between them and Kessler's people any more than my father loved the one that killed him. But when your father asked for a volunteer, and no one else would stand, I could not let you go into that country without someone at your side who knew it." Josephine studied him for a long moment, this quiet man with old grief carved into the set of his shoulders, and felt something shift and settle inside her chest, some early root of tenderness she did not yet have a name for. "Thank you, Timothy," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw the way it caught him off guard, the way a small, unguarded smile broke across his face before he could stop it. "You are welcome, Miss Beckett." "Josephine," she said, "if we are to ride through outlaw territory together, I think we may dispense with formality." "Josephine," he said, testing the shape of it, and she thought she had never heard her own name sound quite so warm in another person's mouth. They reached Prescott as the sun was beginning its long slide toward the western hills, and the depot agent, a bald man with spectacles perched low on his nose, produced the tin case of antitoxin from the cold cellar where it had been stored, along with a hastily scrawled letter of instruction on dosage and administration from a physician in the capital. "You understand this must be kept cool," the agent said, wrapping the vials carefully in wet burlap and packing them into a leather satchel Josephine had brought for the purpose. "And you understand it will begin to lose its potency within 2 days regardless of how carefully you keep it. If you mean to reach Dry Fork, you had best not waste an hour." "We will not," Josephine said, slinging the satchel across her body and cinching the strap tight. Night had fully fallen by the time they left Prescott behind and turned their horses east toward the rough country that lay between them and Dry Fork. And it was here, as the town's lights dwindled behind them, and the desert opened up dark and vast beneath a sky thick with stars, that Timothy explained the route he meant to take. "Devil's Pass is the only road wagons can use," he said, "which is exactly why Kessler holds it. But there is an old trail south of the pass, one my father showed me as a boy, that skirts the worst of the Badlands and comes down into a network of washes that Kessler's men rarely patrol, because it is too narrow and too rough for anything but a horse and rider willing to go slow and careful. It will take us longer than the pass road would, but it stands a far better chance of getting us through unseen." "How much longer?" "Perhaps 6 hours more than the direct road, but the direct road would see us dead or turned back within the first 10 miles. Josephine thought of the fevered children in Dry Fork, of the antitoxin already beginning its slow decay in the tin case at her side, and forced down the fear rising in her throat. "Then we ride through the night," she said. They rode for hours beneath that vast desert sky, the only sounds the soft fall of hooves on sand and stone, the creak of saddle leather, the distant call of a coyote somewhere off in the darkness. Josephine found herself watching the stars, more of them than she had ever seen from the porch of her father's clinic, a great wheeling river of light overhead. And she found, too, that she was watching Timothy, the easy confidence with which he read the land even in darkness, the way he seemed to know without looking which turn to take, which wash to follow, as though the country itself had been written into his blood. "You truly know every foot of this land," she said, some hours before midnight, when they paused to rest the horses in the lee of a great sandstone outcropping. "I used to think I hated it," Timothy admitted, settling onto a flat rock and passing her a canteen. "After my father died, I could not look at these hills without seeing the smoke from our barn. But somewhere along the way, I do not know when exactly, it stopped being the place that took him from me, and it became simply home. I suppose a man cannot hate a thing forever, not if he means to keep living in it." "I feel something like that about medicine," Josephine said, surprising herself with the confession. "My mother died of a fever when I was 16, and my father could not save her, though he tried everything he knew. For a long while I resented every bottle and every book in his clinic, as though they had failed her personally. But then I began to understand that the failure was not in the medicine. It was in how little we knew, how much more there was to learn. So instead of turning away from it, I turned toward it. I have spent 8 years since then learning everything my father could teach me, and reading every medical journal I could get my hands on, though there is no medical college in the territory that will admit a woman, no matter how much she knows." "That does not seem right," Timothy said quietly. "A person with your skill turned away simply for being a woman." "It is not right," Josephine agreed, "but it is the way of things, at least for now. Perhaps it will change. My father says the Eastern colleges have begun admitting women in small numbers. Perhaps someday I will find my way to one of them." "I hope you do," Timothy said, and there was something so plain and sincere in the way he said it that Josephine felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. They rode on through the small hours of the morning, and it was somewhere past 3 in the dark heart of the night, as they picked their way along a narrow trail above a dry wash, that they encountered the riders. Josephine heard them before she saw them, the soft shuffle of horses moving with deliberate quiet, and her hand went instinctively to the revolver at her hip before Timothy's hand closed gently over hers. "Wait," he said softly. "Let me speak first." 4 riders emerged from the shadow of the rocks ahead, and in the pale starlight Josephine could make out enough to know they were not Kessler's men, not white outlaws at all, but a small band of Apache, their leader an older man with silver threading his dark hair, his posture straight and watchful atop a sturdy paint horse. "We mean no harm," Timothy said, raising his empty hand slowly, his voice steady though Josephine could see the tension in his shoulders. "We are only passing through, on an urgent errand. Children are dying of a sickness in the mining camp east of here, and this woman carries medicine that can save them." The older man studied them both for a long moment, his dark eyes moving from Timothy's face to Josephine's, and then to the leather satchel she carried strapped across her chest. "You are Merritt's son," the man said at last in careful, unhurried English. "The one whose father would not fight for either side all those years ago." "Yes," Timothy said, startled. "You knew my father. He shared water with my people in a dry season, when other ranchers would not," the man said. "We do not forget such things. This is not our land any longer, not by any paper the white government recognizes, though it was our land before your fences and your wars came to it. But we still walk it, and we see what happens on it. We have watched Kessler's men, and we have watched the Circle M riders, killing each other over grass and water that once belonged to no one and everyone." He paused, and something like weary sorrow crossed his weathered face. "It is not our fight, but a sickness that kills children is every person's fight. Then you will let us pass?" Josephine asked, finding her voice at last. "More than that," the man said. "Kessler's riders have set a heavy watch along the wash you mean to follow, 3 miles ahead, where it narrows between 2 ridges. They have grown suspicious since word reached them of the sickness in Dry Fork. I think they mean to use it, to demand payment from anyone desperate enough to try to reach the camp with help." His mouth thinned with clear disgust. "There is a higher trail above the wash that we sometimes use to move between the mesas. It is steep and it is narrow, but it will bring you around their watch entirely, and it will save you 2 hours over the wash trail besides." He gave them careful directions, marking the trail's landmarks with quiet precision, and as they parted ways in the darkness, Josephine found herself turning back once more. "Thank you," she called softly, "for your kindness to strangers." The old man's face, in the last moment before the darkness swallowed him and his riders whole, held something that might almost have been a smile. "Save the children," he said. "That is thanks enough." They found the higher trail exactly where the old man had described it, a narrow shelf of rock climbing along the flank of a mesa, and though the horses picked their way along it with careful, anxious steps, by the time the eastern sky had begun to gray with the first hint of dawn, Josephine and Timothy had put Kessler's hidden watch far behind them. It was in the gray hush of that dawn, as they paused to let the horses blow on a wide flat shelf of rock, overlooking a valley just beginning to catch the first pink light of morning, that Josephine allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Cottonwood Falls, to simply breathe. "We are more than halfway," Timothy said, studying the country ahead with a critical eye. "If we push on steadily, we should reach Dry Fork by early afternoon. The serum will still be good." "Thanks to you," Josephine said. "I could never have found that trail on my own, nor known enough to trust a stranger's kindness in the dark." "Thanks to my father," Timothy corrected gently. "It seems even after all these years, his kindness is still saving lives." Josephine looked at him in the growing light, at the exhaustion carved beneath his eyes, at the quiet steadiness that had not once faltered through the long night's ride, and she felt something in her chest that she recognized with something like wonder as the early unmistakable stirrings of love. "Timothy," she said softly, "I do not think I have properly thanked you for what you are risking. Your life, for children you have never met, in a war that is not even yours." "You are risking the same," he said, "and you did not hesitate a moment before offering. That is different. I am a healer. It is my duty. And I am a man who could not stand by and let a woman he admires ride alone into danger," Timothy said, and then seemed to catch himself, a flush of color rising beneath his sun-browned skin, as though the words had escaped before he meant to release them. Josephine felt her own cheeks warm. "A woman you admire," she repeated softly. "I have admired you for 2 years, Josephine Beckett," Timothy said, and having begun the confession, he seemed to find he could not stop it now. "I have watched you at church, and at the harvest dances, tending to every skinned knee and every fevered child in this town with more patience and skill than men twice your age with half your learning. I never believed a woman like you would ever look twice at a man who works another man's cattle for wages, but when your father asked for a volunteer, I knew I would rather die on that trail beside you than live safe in this town, having let you go alone." Josephine's heart was pounding now, and not from the long ride. "I have not thought so little of you as you seem to believe," she said. "I have simply never had the courage to say so." For a long moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the horses cropping at the scrub grass and the far-off cry of a hawk wheeling above the valley. And then Timothy reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hand in his. "When this is done," he said quietly, "when the children are safe and we have ridden home again, I would like very much to court you properly, Josephine, if you would allow it." "I would allow it gladly," she said, and the smile that broke across her face in that gray dawn light was, Timothy would later tell her, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But the tenderness of that moment was not to last unbroken, for it was scarcely an hour later, as they descended from the high trail back toward the lower country that would lead them at last to Dry Fork, that they were spotted. A shout rang out from a ridge above them, and Josephine's head snapped up to see 3 riders silhouetted against the morning sky, and even at that distance she could make out the glint of rifle barrels catching the light. "Kessler's men," Timothy said grimly. "Ride, Josephine, ride now." They spurred their horses into a hard gallop down the slope, and behind them came the crack of rifle fire and the answering shouts of the riders giving chase. And it was here that the story returned to the moment where it had begun, with Josephine low over her mare's neck in the deepening dusk of that long day, the canyon walls rising black around her, Timothy firing back into the gathering darkness to buy them precious seconds. The satchel of serum clutched tight against her chest, as though she could shield it with her own body from the pursuit closing in behind them. "The bend, Josephine, just ahead." Timothy shouted, and she saw it now, the place where the wash narrowed sharply between 2 walls of stone, barely wide enough for a single horse to pass. She reached it first, ducking low as the rock walls closed in on either side, and behind her she heard Timothy's horse thunder through clothes on her heels. And then, abruptly, a sound that stopped her heart cold, a sharp cry of pain from Timothy's throat. She pulled her mare up hard the moment they cleared the narrow passage, wheeling around despite every instinct screaming at her to keep riding, and found Timothy slumped forward in his saddle, one hand pressed hard against his upper arm, dark blood seeping between his fingers. "Timothy." "It is only a graze," he said through gritted teeth, though his voice was tight with pain. "Keep moving, we cannot stop here, they will be through that passage in minutes." "I will not leave you," Josephine said fiercely, already swinging down from her saddle despite the danger, tearing a strip of cloth from her own petticoat with hands that did not shake though her heart hammered against her ribs. She bound the wound as swiftly as her training allowed, pressing hard against the wound to slow the bleeding, and though every second felt like an eternity with pursuit closing behind them, she would not mount again until she was satisfied the makeshift bandage would hold. "There," she said. "It should hold until we can treat it properly. Now can you ride?" "I can ride," Timothy said, and though his face had gone pale, there was steel in his voice. They pushed on through the gathering darkness, and behind them the sound of pursuit began at last to fade, whether because Kessler's riders had lost the trail in the tangle of washes and rock, or because they had simply given up the chase as darkness fell fully across the land, Josephine could not say. But when they finally paused to rest the horses in a sheltered hollow an hour later, no riders had appeared behind them, and for the first time in hours, Josephine allowed herself to believe they might actually survive this journey. It was there, in that sheltered hollow beneath a sky blazing with more stars than Josephine had ever seen in her life, that they came face to face with Silas Kessler himself. He rode alone into the small clearing where they had stopped, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 50 with a graying beard and hard, tired eyes, his rifle resting easy across his saddle horn, though he made no move to raise it. "You have led my men a fine chase, Merritt," Kessler said, his voice carrying the particular weariness of a man who had been fighting a war too long to remember clearly why he had started it. "I ought to have you both shot for trespassing on ground I have claimed." "Ground you have no legal claim to by any deed I have ever seen," Timothy said, his hand drifting toward his revolver despite the wound in his arm. "Legal claim." Kessler laughed, a short, bitter sound. "There is no law out here worth the paper it is written on, boy, only whoever is strong enough to hold what he needs to survive." His gaze shifted to Josephine, taking in the satchel still strapped tight across her chest. "You are the Beckett girl. Word reached me of the sickness in Dry Fork." "Is that the medicine, then, that everyone is so desperate to carry through my territory?" "It is diphtheria antitoxin," Josephine said, meeting his hard gaze without flinching, though her heart pounded against her ribs. 19 children are sick in that camp, Mr. Kessler, 3 already dead. This medicine can save the rest of them if I can reach them before it spoils. I do not care about your war with the Circle M, I care only about the children waiting for me." Something flickered across Kessler's weathered face then, some shadow of pain quickly masked, and Josephine, trained by years at her father's side to read the smallest signs of hidden suffering, saw it and pressed forward before caution could stop her. "Mr. Kessler," she said softly, "is someone in your own family ill?" The silence that followed stretched so long Josephine feared she had overstepped fatally, but at last Kessler's shoulders sagged, and the hard mask of the outlaw leader fell away to reveal simply a frightened father. "My daughter," he said, his voice rough. "Mary, she is 7 years old. She took sick 3 days ago, a fever and a terrible cough, and this morning her breathing turned so labored I feared she would not see nightfall. There is no doctor within 30 miles who is not already at Dry Fork fighting the same sickness, and I dared not send for one through my own blockade, for who would trust an outlaw's plea for mercy?" "Diphtheria," Josephine said quietly, and she saw the word land on him like a physical blow. "It is very likely the same illness that struck Dry Fork. The camp lies close enough that the sickness may have traveled between them on the wind, or through some traveler who passed between the two." "Can you save her?" Kessler asked, and all the hardness had gone out of his voice entirely now, leaving only a father's raw and desperate fear. "I have gold, Miss Beckett, more gold than you could carry, if you will only come to my ranch and save my little girl." Josephine glanced at Timothy, who gave her a small, grim nod, understanding already what she meant to say. "I do not want your gold, Mr. Kessler," Josephine said. "I have 6 vials of antitoxin, enough to treat perhaps 8 or 9 of the sickest children in Dry Fork if I ration it carefully. But I believe I can spare 1 dose for your daughter, if you will let us pass through your territory without hindrance, tonight and every day hereafter, so that Dry Fork need never again fear starving behind your blockade while sickness runs unchecked." Kessler stared at her for a long moment, and Josephine watched the war being fought behind his eyes. The pride of a man who had built his power on fear and violence, now brought low by the one thing gold and guns could never buy, the life of his own child. "You would treat my daughter," he said slowly, "the daughter of the man who has been shooting at your escort for the length of this journey." "I would treat any child who needed it," Josephine said simply. "That is the only oath I have ever sworn, Mr. Kessler, though it was never written on any paper. Sickness does not care about the wars men fight. Neither, in the end, can I." Kessler's jaw worked silently for a moment, and then, to Josephine's astonishment, the hardened outlaw leader bowed his head. "My ranch lies 2 miles from here," he said, his voice thick. "If you would come, I would be forever in your debt, Miss Beckett. And I swear to you, on my daughter's life, that I will lift the blockade on Devil's Pass this very night. There has been enough dying over grass and water. I did not understand until this moment how much more there was to lose." They rode to Kessler's ranch beneath the stars, and there, in a small back bedroom, Josephine found 7-year-old Mary Kessler laboring for breath, her small chest heaving with the terrible effort of a throat closing slowly with disease, and Josephine's hands, though tired from the long ride, did not shake as she prepared the dose, and administered it with the same careful precision she would have used on any patient in her father's clinic. She stayed at the child's bedside for 2 hours, monitoring her breathing, cooling her fever with damp cloths, until at last the worst of the crisis passed, and Mary's breathing eased into something more like sleep than suffocation. "She will need watching through the night," Josephine told Kessler, who had not left the doorway the entire time, his rough hands twisting his hat brim into a ruin. "But I believe the antitoxin has caught the illness before it could close her airway entirely. If her fever breaks by morning, as I expect it will, she should recover fully." Kessler's eyes were wet when he looked at her. "I do not know how to thank you," he said. "I have done terrible things in this territory, Miss Beckett. I do not deserve this kindness." "You do not need to deserve it," Josephine said gently. "That is rather the point of kindness." It was well past midnight when Josephine and Timothy finally rode on toward Dry Fork, Kessler himself riding with them now, his rifle slung across his back rather than held ready, calling ahead to his own scattered riders as they passed to stand down and let the travelers through without hindrance. What had been enemy territory only hours before now opened before them like a road, finally cleared of every obstacle but distance itself. And Josephine, exhausted beyond anything she had known in her life, found herself weeping quietly with relief as the lights of Dry Fork finally came into view against the darkness ahead. Dr. Harlan Graves, a stooped, elderly man with dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of days without sleep, met them at the edge of camp with something between disbelief and desperate hope on his weathered face. "You made it," he said, staring at Josephine as though she were an apparition. "God in heaven, you actually made it through." "5 vials remain," Josephine said, already dismounting, already moving with the brisk efficiency of a healer who had spent a lifetime watching her father work. "Take me to the sickest children first. We will have to ration carefully, but with proper nursing alongside the antitoxin, I believe we can save most of them." What followed was a night Josephine would remember for the rest of her life, moving from bedside to bedside in the crowded infirmary tent that had been raised at the center of the mining camp, administering the precious doses to the children whose conditions were most dire, instructing Dr. Graves and the camp's exhausted mothers in the careful nursing that would be needed for those who could not receive the serum directly, steam tents to ease labored breathing, careful feeding to keep strength up, constant watching through the crisis hours when a child's throat might close without warning. Timothy, his wounded arm now properly bandaged by Josephine's careful hands, did not leave her side through any of it, fetching water, holding lanterns, comforting frightened mothers with a steadiness that seemed to calm the whole camp simply by his presence. And when at last the gray light of dawn began to creep over the eastern ridges, Josephine looked up from the bedside of the last child she had treated, a small boy of 5 whose fever had finally begun to break, and found Timothy watching her with an expression of such open tenderness that she felt her exhaustion fall away entirely. "You saved them," he said softly. "All of them, Josephine, every last one." "We saved them," she corrected, glancing at Dr. Graves, who had collapsed into a chair at the tent's entrance, weeping openly with relief, and at the exhausted mothers still keeping vigil over their sleeping children, and at Timothy himself, whose blood had been spilled to bring this medicine safely through the darkness. "It was never only me." By the time the sun had fully risen over Dry Fork, word had already begun to spread through the camp of the young woman and the wounded cowboy who had ridden through enemy territory in a single night to bring the medicine that had broken the fever of the whole camp's children. And Josephine found herself, exhausted and swaying on her feet, surrounded by grateful miners and their wives pressing her hands and weeping their thanks. And she understood in that moment, more fully than she ever had before, exactly why her father had devoted his whole life to this work. They stayed 3 days in Dry Fork, until Dr. Graves was satisfied that the crisis had fully passed and no more children remained in immediate danger. And it was during those 3 days, in the quiet hours between tending patients, that Josephine and Timothy's fledgling love deepened into something neither of them could any longer deny nor wish to. They walked together in the evenings along the edge of the mining camp, where the desert stretched wide and golden beneath the setting sun, and Timothy told her more of his father, of the barn that had burned, and the years of quiet loneliness that had followed. And Josephine told him of her mother, of the fever that had taken her, and the promise Josephine had made herself in the depths of that grief to spend her life fighting against the ignorance and helplessness that had let it happen. "I used to think," Josephine admitted one evening, as they sat together on an outcropping of rock overlooking the camp, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky, "that I would never find a man who could understand why medicine matters to me more than almost anything else. My father's patients have always come before my own comfort, and I feared any husband would resent that, would want a wife whose whole heart belonged only to him." "I would never ask you to be less than what you are," Timothy said quietly. "I watched you these 3 days, Josephine, working past exhaustion to save children who were strangers to you only a week ago. I do not want a wife whose heart is smaller than yours. I want to stand beside the woman I have seen this week, exactly as she is." "And what of your own heart, Timothy Merritt?" Josephine asked, turning to look at him fully in the fading light. "What do you want for yourself, beyond standing beside me?" He was quiet a long moment, considering the question with the same careful thoughtfulness he brought to everything. "I have spent my whole life since my father died working another man's cattle for wages," he said at last. "I have never had land of my own, nor family beyond the memory of what I lost. But these past days, riding beside you, fighting through that past together, watching you save those children with your own 2 hands, I have begun to imagine a different kind of life. A home. Perhaps a small ranch of my own someday if I can save enough. Children of our own, God willing, who would grow up knowing their mother saved an entire mining camp with nothing but courage and a satchel of medicine." Josephine felt tears rise unbidden to her eyes. "That sounds like a life I would want very much, Timothy." He reached for her hand then, and this time there was no hesitation in either of them. And when he leaned toward her and pressed his lips gently to hers beneath that wide desert sky, Josephine felt something settle into place inside her that she had not even known was missing, a sense of having finally arrived somewhere she had been traveling toward her whole life without knowing it. They rode back toward Cottonwood Falls on the 4th day, taking the direct road through Devil's Pass now, for Kessler had been true to his word and lifted the blockade entirely. And as they passed the outlaw's ranch on the way, they stopped to check on Mary, who greeted them from her porch swing with rosy cheeks and a wide gap-toothed smile that told Josephine everything she needed to know about the child's full recovery. "Miss Beckett," Mary called out, running down the porch steps despite her father's mild protest that she ought not overexert herself so soon after her illness. "Papa says you saved my life. Is that true?" "I only helped a little," Josephine said, crouching down to the child's level. "Your own strong heart did most of the work." Kessler emerged onto the porch behind his daughter, and the transformation in the man since that desperate night was remarkable to see. The hard lines of his face softened, the weariness of years of fighting replaced by something like peace. "I have sent word to the Circle M," he told Timothy, as Josephine visited with Mary. "I have proposed a meeting to settle the water dispute properly, through arbitration rather than gunfire. I do not know if they will agree, but I mean to try. Too many people have suffered for this feud, and I will not let it cost another child their life, on either side of it." "That is a fine thing you are doing, Mr. Kessler," Timothy said. "It is the least I owe," Kessler said, glancing toward Josephine and his daughter with an expression of profound gratitude. "A man who is willing to shoot at strangers for trespassing on disputed grass ought to remember, when his own child's life hangs in the balance, exactly how little any of that grass is worth." As they finally rode on toward Cottonwood Falls, the story of what had happened seemed to travel ahead of them on some invisible current. for by the time they crested the last ridge above the town and saw its familiar rooftops spread out below in the golden afternoon light, a small crowd had already gathered at the edge of Main Street, drawn by word that had somehow reached them from passing travelers of the miraculous ride through Devil's Pass. Josephine's father stood at the front of that crowd, leaning on his cane, and when Josephine slid down from her mare and ran to him, he wrapped his arms around her with a strength that belied his age and his injured hip, weeping openly into her hair. "I feared I would never see you again," he said. "When you did not return by the second day, I feared the worst." "I am here, Papa," Josephine said. "I am here, and Timothy is here, and every child in Dry Fork is alive because of it." Word of the outbreak's resolution, and of the daring ride that had saved it, spread through the territory in the weeks that followed, carried by freight drivers and telegraph wires alike, until even the territorial newspaper in Prescott ran a small article praising the courage of a young woman doctor's daughter, and the cowboy who had ridden with her through what the paper called, with more drama than precision, the most dangerous stretch of ground in the territory. But it was not the newspaper's praise that mattered to Josephine in the weeks that followed, nor even the gratitude of Dry Fork's families, though that gratitude touched her deeply and would follow her for years in the form of letters and small gifts sent from the camp each Christmas thereafter. What mattered most was the quiet, steady courtship that grew between her and Timothy Merritt in the ordinary days that followed their extraordinary journey. The Sunday afternoons spent walking together along the creek that ran behind the mercantile. The evenings when Timothy would ride into town after his work at the Circle M was finished, still smelling of horse and dust and hard labor. To sit on the porch of Dr. Beckett's clinic and talk with Josephine long into the night about everything and nothing at all. Silas Kessler, true to his word, had indeed brought the Circle M's owner, a hard but ultimately reasonable man named Harlan Cutter, to the negotiating table, and it was through those negotiations, conducted with the help of a territorial judge sent from Prescott, that a startling truth finally emerged. The water dispute that had cost so many lives and so much suffering had not, in fact, arisen from any genuine scarcity, but had been quietly manufactured and inflamed over the course of 2 years by a land speculator named Jasper Cole, who had been buying up parcels of both disputed properties at rock-bottom prices from ranchers desperate to sell after losing cattle and hands to the violence. Intending to consolidate the entire valley under his own name, once both sides had exhausted themselves fighting. The revelation, when it finally came to light through careful examination of land records and the testimony of a disgruntled clerk who had once worked for Cole, shocked the whole territory, and it was Timothy, still carrying some of his father's old grief over a range war fought for reasons that had never made sense to him, who rode to Prescott himself to bring the evidence before the territorial marshal, ensuring that Cole's scheme was exposed and his ill-gotten land claims voided by court order before he could profit from a single acre of the suffering he had engineered. "My father died for nothing," Timothy told Josephine, the evening after the marshal's ruling was announced, his voice thick with old sorrow, finally beginning, perhaps, to find some measure of peace. "Or worse than nothing, for a lie some greedy man invented to make himself richer, but at least now the truth is known. At least now Kessler and Cutter can make peace over something real instead of fighting over a ghost." "Your father did not die for nothing," Josephine said gently, taking his hand. "He died trying to stay decent in an indecent situation, trying to hold onto what was right when everyone around him had lost sight of it. You have spent your whole life honoring that, Timothy, whether you realized it or not. You did it again on that ride to Dry Fork when you chose to protect a stranger's children over your own safety. That is not nothing. That is everything a good man's life should mean." It was on a clear evening in early December, some 6 weeks after their journey through Devil's Pass, that Timothy Merritt rode into Cottonwood Falls with a small velvet box tucked carefully into his saddlebag, purchased with 3 months' hard-saved wages from a jeweler in Prescott, and found Josephine on the porch of her father's clinic, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the evening chill, watching the last light fade from the western sky. "Josephine," he said, dismounting and approaching the porch steps with a nervousness that seemed almost comical given everything they had already faced together, "I have ridden through gunfire beside you, and I did not feel half so frightened as I do standing here now." She laughed softly, rising from her chair. "Whatever is the matter, Timothy?" He knelt on the porch steps before her, and Josephine's breath caught as she understood at last what was happening. "I have no grand ranch to offer you," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands as he opened the small velvet box to reveal a simple gold band, "and no fortune beyond what an honest cowboy can earn through years of hard labor. But I have loved you since before I ever had the courage to speak to you, Josephine Beckett, and I have loved you more with every day since that ride through Devil's Pass, watching you save a whole camp of children with nothing but your skill and your courage. I do not believe I will ever meet another woman who could match you, nor do I wish to try. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life standing beside you, exactly as you are?" Josephine's eyes filled with tears, and she reached down to cup his face in her hands. "Timothy Merritt," she said, "I would have married you the moment you told me you would not let me ride into danger alone. Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were wed the following spring, in April of 1897, in a small ceremony held in the yard behind Dr. Beckett's clinic, beneath an arbor of blooming wisteria that Josephine's father had planted years before in memory of his late wife. The whole of Cottonwood Falls turned out for the celebration, and to everyone's quiet astonishment, so too did a delegation from Dry Fork, led by Dr. Harlan Graves himself, who had traveled the now peaceful road through Devil's Pass to witness the wedding of the woman who had saved his camp's children. Silas Kessler came as well, his daughter Mary now fully recovered and grown taller, presenting Josephine with a bouquet of wildflowers gathered from the very hillside where her fever had once nearly claimed her life. "I never thought," Kessler told Josephine quietly, as the wedding festivities carried on around them, the sound of a fiddle and the smell of roasting beef filling the warm spring evening, "that the woman who rode through my own blockade to save children I did not know would end up saving my own daughter, and teaching an old outlaw the meaning of mercy besides. I owe you a debt I can never fully repay, Mrs. Merritt." The name still sounded strange and wonderful to Josephine's ears. "You owe me nothing, Mr. Kessler," she said, "watching you and Mr. Cutter finally settle your dispute peacefully, watching Dry Fork and Cottonwood Falls trade freely along a road that no longer runs with fear, that is repayment enough for anything I did." Dr. Beckett gave a small speech at the wedding, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of his late wife, of his daughter's courage, of the young cowboy who had proven himself worthy of a family's deepest trust. "I have watched my daughter grow from a grieving girl into the finest healer I have ever known," he said, raising his glass to the assembled crowd. "And I have watched Timothy Merritt prove, through fire and danger, that his character matches hers in every measure of courage and devotion. I could not have chosen a better man to stand beside her, nor a better woman to stand beside him. May God bless this union with the same strength that carried them both through Devil's Pass and home again." In the years that followed, Timothy used his savings, along with a generous gift from a grateful Harlan Cutter, who had come to see the young cowboy as something like the son he had never had, to purchase a modest parcel of land along the Verd River, not far from the very hills where his father had once run cattle before losing everything to violence and greed. There, he and Josephine built a small ranch house together, and Josephine, with her father's blessing and increasing frailty requiring her assistance regardless, continued to practice medicine alongside him, treating patients from both Cottonwood Falls and the now thriving trade route that ran through what had once been called Devil's Pass, but which the local newspaper, in a fit of romantic revisionism that Josephine always found faintly amusing, had taken to calling Mercy's Crossing in honor of the ride that had first opened it to peaceful travel. 2 years after their wedding, in the spring of 1899, Josephine gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy they named Elias, after her father, who wept with joy at the honor and lived to see his grandson take his first unsteady steps across the porch of the ranch house, before passing peacefully in his sleep the following winter, content in the knowledge that his life's work and his daughter's courage would carry on into a new generation. 3 years after Elias came a daughter, whom they named Mary, in honor of the Kessler girl whose life Josephine had saved on that long, desperate night, and whose father had ridden all the way from his own ranch to stand as the child's godfather, weeping unashamedly at the christening as he held the infant in his weathered hands. "You have given my daughter's name a second life," Silas Kessler told Josephine at the christening, his voice thick with emotion. "I do not know how a man repays a debt like that, except to try, for the rest of his own life, to be worthy of the mercy that was shown to him." By the time their third child arrived, a second son they named Timothy after his father, Josephine had finally realized her long-held dream of formal medical education. For the territorial legislature, influenced in no small part by the widely told story of her ride through Devil's Pass, had passed a measure 2 years prior admitting women to study at the newly established medical college in Prescott. And Josephine, though already a wife and mother of 2, had traveled by train twice a month for 18 months to complete the coursework and examinations required to earn her formal license, becoming the first woman doctor in the entire territory, a distinction she wore with quiet pride but never once let overshadow the deeper joy she found in her family and her marriage. Timothy, for his part, built the small ranch into a modest but thriving operation, running cattle across land that had once been soaked in the blood of a war fought over lies, and he never once, in all the years that followed, forgot the lesson his father's death and his own ride through Devil's Pass had taught him, that the truest measure of a man's worth lay not in the land he claimed or the fights he won, but in the courage he showed when someone else's life depended on his willingness to risk his own. On quiet evenings, when their children had grown old enough to beg for stories before bed, Josephine and Timothy would sit together on the porch of their ranch house, the same porch where Timothy had once knelt to ask for her hand, and tell them the story of the night their mother had ridden through enemy territory with nothing but a satchel of medicine and a cowboy's steady aim to protect her, of the outlaw who had learned mercy from watching his own daughter saved by a stranger's kindness, of the old Apache man who had shown that true enemies were never the people the fearful imagination painted them to be, but only the greed and cruelty that turned neighbor against neighbor when there was no one brave enough to stand against it. "And did you know then, Mama," young Mary would always ask, her eyes wide in the lamplight, "that you would fall in love with Papa on that very ride?" "I knew it," Josephine would answer, taking Timothy's weathered hand in hers, "the moment he stood up in that meeting and said he would not let me ride alone. I think, in truth, some part of me had loved him long before that. In every quiet kindness I had watched him show to this town for years without ever once expecting anything in return. It only took Devil's Pass to show me what had been true all along." Timothy would smile then, the same smile Josephine had first seen break across his face on that gray dawn above the wash trail, and pull his wife close against his side as their children settled into contented sleep around them. And the desert night would close soft and peaceful over the ranch house, over the land that had once been called enemy territory and was now simply home, over the family that had been born from courage and medicine, and a love that had proven in the end stronger than any war men could invent to divide them. And so it was that in the small towns scattered across that stretch of Arizona territory, the story of Josephine Beckett's ride was told and retold for years afterward, growing perhaps a little larger with each telling, as such stories always do, but never once losing the simple truth at its heart, that a young woman's courage and a cowboy's steady devotion had carried life-saving medicine through the darkest ground the territory had to offer, and had found in that same darkness a love bright enough to light the way home for both of them, and for every child on either side of every fence, whose lives they had touched along the way.